this talk began as a sort of impromptu rant at a conference when, as I'll go on to explore, we were talking about the emerging notion of responsible research and innovation, and it became clear over the course of that conference, which is in Rome a couple of years ago, that excellence was one of these words that we all were talking about, that was used and crops up in European Commission literature and on posters and all the rest of it. And yet it is unproblematized in that we don't really question what it means. But it seems to be that in its current usage it is problematic. And as part of that, I was invited to ISPRA in June to continue that discussion. And so I guess this talk today is an extension of that, trying to get a little bit deeper into what I think it is that we're talking about when we talk about excellence, and why it would be that we might be against it. And it is, I mean, the title is deliberately provocative, except that when I've mentioned this to people, and I've said, yeah, I'm going to develop the idea that we might be against excellence, being against something that is so unequivocally good would seem to be an easy provocation to make. And yet, the more one has that discussion, the more one realizes that actually maybe it isn't such a provocative thing to do. Maybe excellence is one of these things that actually we're all against, but that we don't think that it's hugely important to worry about or to problematize. And so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. Let me just start you off with some of the sort of the rhetorical use of excellence as a sort of public relations strategy in British and international science policy. Excellence, I think we could conclude, is everywhere in science policy. Right? We are, I would argue, increasingly talking about this notion of excellence, and it is manifest informally and formally in the processes, procedures, cultures that govern science and innovation, and I would argue in problematic ways. So these are some recent moments from British science policy that I would give you. The first one is the renaming of the research assessment exercise as the research excellence framework. And we went through this process last year, and it has given various universities certainly a license to trumpet their excellence to the world, and is an interesting exercise because it has allowed for multiple definitions of excellence to be invoked. And so we've seen many universities claim first place in various different metrics. You can find almost any combination of measures that you like to demonstrate that you are the best university in the country. And we saw, again last year, a science and innovation strategy come out from the Department of Business and Innovation and Skills that mentions excellence, talks about it multiple times, without talking about other things that I regard as important, like, what science and innovation are for, or notions of equality, or addressing grand challenges. But here it defines excellence in particular terms, and we see that the notion of excellence as an endpoint quickly becomes defined as excellence as a process. And we'll get into this more, that excellence isn't really to talk about excellence is not to talk about quality, it's to talk about who decides. It's to talk about quality control rather than quality as an endpoint. And more recently, we have seen, in the context of the British spending review that has just been announced, that there is likely to be movements in the machinery of government science policy such that we're likely to see a rationalising of the British research councils. And Paul Nurse's review of this. Paul Nurse is president of the Royal Society at the moment, soon to stand down. And here he runs through the rationale for why continued government funding for science is so important, and why the structures of funding allocation, and in particular the preservation of what's been called the Haldane principle, through which funding is determined largely autonomously by the Research Council and scientific community themselves, leads to excellence. Here we see excellence defined as the assessment by highly accomplished researchers in the relevant field. So we see that excellence appeals to a particular version of an argument to do with scientific autonomy, and here to do with disciplinary specialization. The research excellence framework also introduces additional criteria into the science policy landscape in the UK, not least the criterion to assess and to talk about impact. So the strapline, the first of my straplines that I put up, was the Research Council strapline that they claim to deliver excellence with impact. And we can consider whether those things are seen as complementary or considered or seen as oppositional. I don't think that's necessarily clear at this stage, and I'm sort of relaxed about its lack of clarity, because having worked in policy, I am all too aware that sometimes definitional flexibility allows you to build constituencies in policy discussions that are important. But here we have, in terms of how these criteria are manifest in science policy, a rather interesting separation in which excellence is assessed, this is by the research councils, so in the awarding of research funding, excellence is assessed by disciplinary peers and then ranked in the usual way, and only excellent research will get through. At the same time, we have an additional imposition of what's called a pathway to impact requirement in a research funding bid, which is deemed to be, you don't have to have excellent impact, if you like. You just have to have adequate impact. So you have to show that you're paying attention to some of the sorts of things that people like me, interested in the broader impacts of science and innovation, might regard as important, whereas excellence remains the primary criterion as defined by the funders. And of course, at the European level, we have explicit consideration of excellent science as one of the three pillars of Horizon 2020, the others being competitive industries and better society. Again, it sort of becomes a science policy game to point at vacuous European Union rhetoric. I don't think that's not what I'm trying to do here. But what I am interested in is the separation of policy concerns with better society from those of scientific excellence. So they are seen as different domains. And the way in which this is implemented, and this is a point made by this report that came out from a group of STS and science policy scholars under the aegis of the European Science Foundation a couple of years ago, is that excellence and relevance, how those two things are interpreted, would seem to be drifting apart. It's harder and harder to maintain an interest in scientific excellence as it's defined, and in notions of relevance or impact, or in the European Union terms, a better society, than it has ever been. So if you look under on the Horizon 2020 website, what counts as scientific excellence, you will be unsurprised to see that the European Research Council is seen as the major delivery mechanism for this. And the European Research Council offers its own definition of scientific excellence, where they, in their own terms, use excellence to assess excellence. So it's an admission that this is a self-perpetuating situation, and the European Research Council are admittedly honest about that in ways that some other research funders are not. Why does all of this matter? Well, I think it's put into stark relief when we relate this to a discussion that has just started to take off at the European level and to an extent at the nation-state level as well, which is about this idea of responsible research and innovation. Responsible research and innovation is an idea that, well, is it an idea or a set of terminologies or a set of mechanisms? It's sort of all of these things. Again, there's a huge flexibility in the interpretation of this phrase, but if it's a phrase at least that I've been involved in researching, in developing, and to some extent also to advocating for. At the European level, responsible research and innovation has become a sort of coalescing term for various policy agendas, some of which relate to older questions of responsibility in science and innovation, some of which have joined rather uncomfortably for reasons of political expediency. So debates around gender and science education, which have their own histories and their own politics, their own constituencies, meet those to do with open science, to do with governance, to do with ethics. And we see responsible research and innovation sort of as the uncomfortable hold-all for some of these terms. It sort of becomes extremely hard to explain responsible research and innovation in the European Union's own terms, but I have my own sense of why it matters and what it's for, and my explanation relates to two main criteria. And these are two perennial debates within science and innovation policy. The first relates to grand societal challenges and the role that science and innovation plays within them. The second one relates to the uncertainties of emerging technologies. The first, my starting point with any discussion about grand challenges in science and innovation is a book that was published in 1977 by Dick Nelson. And Nelson asked a deceptively simple question of science and innovation policy. He said, how is it that during the 1970s, the world's richest economy was able to put a man on the moon, but seemed resolutely incapable of solving the problems of its own ghettos? He called this the moon and the ghetto problem. And his response to his own question was twofold. First, that some problems are easy to solve, and while we may talk about rocket science, it turns out that rocket science is actually pretty easy. Solving problems of poverty, solving problems of social inequality is not rocket science. It's far harder than rocket science, partly because one cannot agree on what the problem looks like, nor can one tell consensually what whether the problem has been solved if and when such solutions present themselves. The second part of Nelson's argument was that we tend to over-prioritize high-tech approaches to problems and downplay complicated political approaches to what we would now refer to as wicked problems. This discussion has fallen out of fashion a little bit, came back, interestingly, when a similar conundrum presented itself, and this was highlighted by The Economist magazine, when India launched its Mars mission last year. So India now has an orbiter around Mars, and the question The Economist asked, in the similar sort of vein to Nelson's, was how is it that a country that is unable to feed its own population is able to put a probe around Mars? Now, I mean, the point is not to say in a neo-colonial way, that a particular country has the wrong priorities, but in asking the question, we can begin to have a discussion about where we think priorities lie and why some problems look easier to tackle than others. It was also noted at the time, actually, and this is something that I will come on to in a bit, how very different the Indian mission control looked from NASA's mission control of the 60s and 70s, not least because of the large number of women involved in the launch of that rocket. And we'll come on to talk about the excellence and how excellence relates to the discussion about gender in science in a second. The privileging of technological approaches to seemingly intractable, wicked problems continues, albeit in a different guise. Here is a statement that Bill Gates made in 2014, where he argued that such were the power of science and technology that we would see almost no poor countries left in the world by 2035. And it is a classic game of the science and technology policy scholar to point to predictions and highlight how they are likely to be wrong with reference to past predictions that have been shown to be wrong. But Bill Gates would have done well to remember a similar prediction that was made by another scientific enthusiast, C.P. Snow, in a forgotten part of the Two Cultures lectures from 1959. He argued that such were the power of science and technology that they would close the gap between rich and poor by the year 2000. And what we know from science policy scholarship is not just that gap has got wider, but that science and technology are almost certainly implicated in the widening of the gap because of the tendency for the benefits of technological progress to accrue to those who are already most able to afford them and most and in the positions of greatest power. The tendency to imagine technological solutions to intractable problems. Again, it's a familiar story of science and technology policy scholarship, going back to Alvin Weinberg's criticisms of the technological fix developed in the 1960s. Remember that Alvin Weinberg was an enthusiast for the technological fix, while appreciating that we needed to be clear about when and where such technological fixes might apply. The phrase technological fix has now become a rather pejorative one. Evgeny Morozov argues in this, in a brilliantly angry book, I think, that the enthusiasm for technological fixes is no longer what it was, in the sense of cold warriors looking for problems to use their rather impressive hammers on. What he argues is that instead the manifestation of the technological approach resembles what he calls solutionism, which is the presumption that there are technological solutions to these problems, but also the morphing of these problems such that they become amenable to particular solutions. And so he would point to the rhetoric of Silicon Valley, which increasingly talks about the innovations that come out of Silicon Valley not just as useful in terms of tools for filling particular first world problems, if you like, but Also that these tools are so powerful that they will be able to, as Eric Schmidt has it there, fix all the world's problems, whatever that might mean. And the lack of scrutiny of that sort of rhetoric is what would interest Evgeny Morozov. The seeming disparity between the solutions emerging from the new masters of the universe in Silicon Valley and the problems facing people in poorer parts of the world is noticed not just by scholars of science and technology studies, but also people like the Pope. The Pope, in his recent statement about climate change, actually provides an extremely good science and technology studies summary of criticisms of conventional approaches to climate change. So he will rapidly become the most cited science and technology studies scholar around. Here he is a year earlier talking to those masters of the universe at Davos and saying we need to address this problem. Right? We need to take more seriously the idea that wishful thinking combined with scientific excellence, business as usual, will not solve the problems of poverty, even though it becomes extremely easy for us to pretend that it will. These systemic imbalances are revealed all over the place and give us the driver for a new approach to responsible research and innovation. So we see what has now become a familiar diagnosis of what's called the 1090 gap, in which 90% of the world's disease burden attracts only 10% of its research and development money. These imbalances are even more starkly observed when you look at published research on particular diseases, in which we see the research following the money rather than following the human need. We can come. This slide raises as many questions as it presents answers, so we can come back to that if people wish. But also we can look at disparities between need and investment that don't just relate to issues of poverty, but relate to, for example, the need to generate energy in new ways. And we see here, this is a graph prepared by, in fact, the physicist Richard Jones at the University of Sheffield, who has become increasingly interested in responsible research and innovation. The imperative he presents is this one, which is that at the same time as we are most in urgent need of new energy innovation, we are systemically underinvesting in energy, largely because of the privatization of global energy markets. And there seems, we would appear to be able to do nothing about this, because the strategic research on energy that existed in the wake of the Second World War has largely dwindled, and so we are in fact leaving it up to scientific autonomy and market forces to deliver new energy solutions, and according to Richard Jones, it simply isn't working. However, what we have is some interesting new initiatives. So this is something that has come out of the Paris COP over the last week. Is, if you like, not a strategic nation-state attempt to address this gap, but a coalition of heads of state and business leaders. So you'll see down there, you've got Bill Gates standing amongst the world's leaders, announcing what has been called Mission Innovation, would seem to be answering some calls that have been around for a while for, if you like, an Apollo program for energy, a coherent, joined-up, substantial investment in new energy technologies. All of this gets us in conventional science policy terms into a rather difficult area, which is an area, so here covered in the pages of Nature, a classic home of a conventional definition of what we might call excellence, talking about impact, or as they call it, the science that matters. Now, we all probably have our own issues with the notion of impact as it's conventionally described, not least because it presumes that it presumes a linear model in which impact happens last and makes a difference to the world without prior consideration of what it would take upstream to come up with science and innovation that make a difference. But the concern of responsible research and innovation is, at least in part, with this notion of the science that matters. It's a perennial science policy debate about how to align scientific priorities with societal needs. The second driver for responsible research and innovation, particularly at the front of mind of European policymakers, relates to the uncertainties of emerging technologies, and they will, policymakers at the Commission associated with responsible research and innovation, if one asks them for a justification for why this is a continuing, expanding policy domain, they are likely to at some point mention genetically modified crops. This picture here is a picture of a field trial of genetically modified camelina at Rothamsted Research in Britain. This field became the site of an extremely interesting debate, protest in 2012, when there was a trial of genetically modified wheat there after a period of more than maybe about a decade or so where trials either took place pretty secretively or not at all, following the controversy over genetically modified crops and food that was repeated in various ways around Europe. And concern about what was seen as the surprising disconnect between public and scientific opinion on genetically modified crops led to attempts to institute new approaches to nanotechnology. So this is a field of carbon nanotubes that I've got here. And subsequently, we had a controversy over the rollout of smart meters in the Netherlands, in which concerns about ethics were detected too late for the government to be able to include them in the innovation and rollout of this technology, such that millions of euros were in effect wasted when the planned rollout of smart meters was killed by the Dutch upper house. We now see experiments in new forms of engagement taking place around synthetic biology in the UK and the US and elsewhere, where the scientists involved and the policymakers have determined that they will take a more responsible, more open, more engaged approach. One of the vehicles for this more engaged approach has been a formalized mode of public dialogue on new science and technology. And again, I've been involved in advocating and trying to understand the implementation of those experiments. This is the report from a large dialogue experiment that was that took place under the aegis of two of the research councils around synthetic biology. And the report that came out was interesting, not in terms of the answers that it provided, in terms of what do the public think about this new area of science and technology, but in terms of the questions that it generated and advised that these should be reflected back on the scientists themselves. So the report argued that scientists and policymakers working in this area needed to ask themselves, these sorts of questions about where synthetic biology was going. These questions don't relate just to the risks of synthetic biology, but to the trajectory of it. Where is this going? What will it do? Who will benefit? And these questions are familiar ones for science and technology studies, but have struggled to enter public policy discussions. The response of one of the research councils in the UK, the Engineering and Physical Sciences Research Council, was to explore its own responsibilities, to say, for the first time, really, actually, how do we, as a funding body, have agency in this debate? How should we be thinking about our own responsibilities in this regard? They commissioned what became a framework for responsible innovation that I was involved in advising them on. And the framework for responsible innovation that we devised drew from, again, some familiar science and technology studies, diagnoses of pathologies with past innovation. Pathologies to do with the dynamic that we, for example, tend to always recognize the problems of science and innovation in hindsight, rather than being able to anticipate issues in advance, that we seem unable to control science and innovation because they are regarded as simply too unpredictable, that risks can emerge systemically as well as just from the nature of emerging technologies themselves, that we become locked in to scientific and technological systems without realizing it at the time. I've already mentioned the critiques of technological fixes, and the list goes on. In response to these pathologies of innovation, how might we then think about notions of responsibility? So, scientists, when asked by me or by colleagues about notions of responsible innovation, typically have presented two responses. The first one of which is, well, why would we be irresponsible? Science regards itself rightly as a particular culture of responsibility. They would be the first to suggest that they have responsibilities, but also that those responsibilities are deployed proactively and on the whole well in terms of public opinion, and they would be able to point to, for example, the high levels of public trust as evidence for that. But the second response is, well, does this mean that as a scientist I will be held responsible for the future developments of my research? Isn't that like saying that Albert Einstein is to blame for the atomic bomb? Notions of responsibility, therefore, are problematic in science and innovation. The argument that we put forward was that responsibility has to be seen as something else. It can't be seen as this retrospective thing. It can't be seen in a legalistic sense. It has to be regarded as something that is prospective, that is proactive, and something that is shared. And so the notion of parenthood is a better analogy, I would argue. That we expect parents to take care of their children, even though their children's lives will be uncertain, and we expect parents to be able to respond to certain conditions, and that is part of the duty of care of parenthood. Parenthood is less about just blaming parents for the behaviour of their children. As a father of 3 children, I would hate to be blamed for all of their bad behaviour, even though clearly I'm accountable for at least some of it. And so the model of responsibility that we have tried to encourage is one that is prospective, recognising that the scientific community have tended to adopt a model in the past in which the responsibilities to science, their role responsibilities, often are seen as trumping their wider societal responsibilities. So while all scientists would appreciate naturally that they had responsibilities towards the production of robust knowledge, fewer would be comfortable engaging in the sorts of debates that we saw originally at Asilomar in 1975. We've seen in the last week with the National Academy Summit on gene editing, those sort of bigger discussions about, well, where is science going and how does it fit into society? So we define responsible innovation in very different terms from those being deployed in Europe. The definition is deliberately large, deliberately inclusive, such that it can encompass a range of scientific disciplines, a range of technologies. I won't go into the small print on this slide in detail, but drawing on science and technology studies literature in this area, we have described responsible innovation as comprising 4 dimensions. The first being one of anticipation, the second being one of greater inclusion, both of which I've talked about. The third being about reflexivity, so encouraging scientists and innovators themselves to think about their own assumptions. And the fourth one, which we regarded as the missing piece of the jigsaw, is one of responsiveness. So if new engagements between science and society generate new questions, how do we begin to respond to those questions? How might science and innovation steer itself in new directions that encourage greater public value? I'm going to skip through the details of those things to look at this question of responsiveness in some more detail. So what is the major consideration within responsiveness? Well, we would argue it's to think about the various dynamics that limit the ability of science and innovation to change direction in the face of public concerns or questions. And one of these limits to responsiveness, I would argue, is the notion of scientific excellence. So it comes to the central question of what we regard as the best science. Now, Helga Novotny is, many of you will know her, plays an interesting few roles in this discussion. When she offered this explanation of scientific excellence, she was president of the European Research Council, but people in science and technology studies will also know her as a leading science and technology studies thinker. So here, Novotny is recognizing a sense of the trouble with narrow views of excellence and insisting that it is and can be a multidimensional concept as it's being implemented in the European Research Council, but she admits in the same piece that it does tend to concentrate research funding if used in its current way. So here we get back to a debate within science and technology policy about concentration, which, again, most policymakers, certainly in Britain, would now be relaxed about. They are relaxed about Britain having a highly concentrated research and innovation system. They would be relaxed that the money often follows those scientists and those institutions that have already demonstrated evidence of success in the past. But Robert Merton's point that he's making here when he talks about what he calls the Matthew effect, from the parable of the talents, to him that hath shall be given, when he talks about the Matthew effect, he regards it as potentially problematic as well. Is it okay to just let the money follow past scientific achievements, or does that impede other science policy goals? Now, Helga Novotny, in her previous life, had been part of a group of science and technology studies scholars who had produced an enormously influential description of, if you like, what they diagnosed as the changing social contract between science and society a couple of decades ago, in which they talk about the trouble with excellence. And they argue that under a system of mode 2 science, they called it, in which we can no longer just rely on scientific measures of quality to deliver societal benefits. We would need necessarily to expand a definition of scientific excellence. Has that happened? Well, my diagnosis would be that far from the definition of excellence expanding as the social contract between science and society changes, actually what we've seen is a narrowing of this definition and an ignorance of the tensions that it presents with other science policy goals. So I'd like to juxtapose two conferences that took place under the aegis of the Danish presidency of the European Union in 2012. This is the Danish science minister at the time arguing at a conference, Excellence 2012, Excellence Revisited, the Value of Excellence. I think they might be over-egging that particular pudding. He argued there in the statement after that conference that excellence is the way forward in science policy. But the next week, he was at a conference on responsible research and innovation where he said something that would seem to contradict the speech of the previous week. We need to shift the focus from the best science in the world to creating the best science for the world. This is an admission that, if you like, relevance needs to be a greater consideration than excellence. Now, I'm conscious that I'm running out of time, but I just wanted to mention, rather than dwell on, the particular way in which scholars of science, technology, and gender have sought to unpack this notion of scientific excellence as itself a gendered term, because it's here, I think, that actually some of the productive, critical work is being done. I'll skip over the various structural inequalities of my former employer, the Royal Society, to mention some studies that have been done suggesting that, according to conventional criteria of peer review, there are systemic biases against female researchers. This is a very influential paper that was published in Nature in 1997 that found within the Swedish Medical Research Council, women researchers were far more likely to receive worse assessments of their competence, even though metrics would suggest that they were of the same impact as equivalent male scientists. Gabrielle Griffin, in a European Commission, collection of policy papers, argues that scientific excellence is problematic in all sorts of ways, that it is gendered, that it tends to reinforce existing power structures, even though it makes the claim to be ruthlessly meritocratic. And I think that's one of the important issues here. Under the guise of meritocracy, so under the guise of being blind to conventional social categories, excellence would seem to be reinforcing those categories, which we might regard as a problem. So the central question then is about who defines excellence. If we think that it is a permanent fixture on the science policy landscape, who defines excellence? And I'll just end by opening up some questions about how we measure, how we define excellence. And here I think the scientometrics world is beginning to explore the problems of narrow views of disciplinary excellence. So this is an influential paper by Ishmael Raffles and colleagues, which argues that interdisciplinary work systemically does worse in research assessments based on metrics than single discipline work. And Raffles has made the argument that what we need are metrics for what he calls opening up research assessments, such that we can make ideas of quality genuinely multi-dimensional. Given that I've run out of time, my suggestion is that I will end there, but then come back to anything if people want to follow up. Thank you.
Thanks, Jack, for your talk. Thanks, Angela, for having me here. Good to be back as well. To get my message out straight away, it's actually in the title. I don't think that debating for or against excellence really helps us in coming up with an informed science policy, and it's the latter, I guess, that we're ultimately after. So at the end of my presentation, I will come up with 4 suggestions that might help in getting to such an informed science policy. Okay. Just a bit of my outline. What I will do first is to talk a little bit about. No, it's good. Again. A little bit about research evaluation in general, and I will try to put Jack's talk in its context, where it came from. Then I will move on to defining excellence, or in the discussion on that. We'll make some observation about Dutch science policy, a context I'm currently working in. And finally, I will spend a few words on the cost and benefits of research evaluation systems. I think there's one thing we actually can agree upon, and that's against excellence doesn't mean that you're against evaluation. And Jack even mentioned it in his Guardian paper, that he's not against evaluation. And I think that's a good point, because if we look at, well, just from an economics perspective, I'd say given that resources for research are scarce, we have to make decisions about what to support and what not. And this issue became especially pregnant when Derek de Stoller Price came up with his book, Little Science, Big Science, where he showed the exponential growth of science. And as you might know, resources are not unlimited, then immediately we have the problem there. So we have to make choices. So research evaluation, I'd say, is not the problem here per se. Then something about putting Jack's talk in its context. As he mentioned, it's clearly situated for me in the UK, where there was first a research assessment exercise, and then they moved to research excellence framework. Initially, when this discussion was brought up, this was, I'd say, around 2010, perhaps a bit earlier. There was a lot of emphasis on the societal relevance that should make a clear component of this research excellence framework. And then voices came out that this might lead to a shift of boundaries of academic autonomy, which it might not be good. And then Ben Martin came out with characterizing the risk of research excellence framework as a Frankenstein monster. I wonder, and this is just a question, I don't know the nitty-gritty details, that perhaps we might be back to the research assessment exercise in disguise at the moment. Again, for me, this merely puts the question, okay, what kind of excellence then are we actually talking about? And I think we have many flavors, but let me just point out 2 of them, 2 opposing ones. Jack already mentioned Alvin Weinberg, and opposite to him we can position Michael Polanyi, not to be confused with his brother Karl Polanyi. What Weinberg said is that science must seek its support from society on grounds other than the science is carried out competently and that it is ready for exploitation. Scientists cannot expect society to support science because scientists find an enchanting diversion. And then we have Polanyi, where he says in the Republic of Science paper in Minerva, any attempt at guiding scientific research towards a purpose other than its own is an attempt to deflect it from the advancement of science. For it can advance only by essentially unpredictable steps, pursuing problems of its own, and the practical benefits of these advances will be incidental, hence doubly unpredictable. Both come up with a set of criteria, external criteria. For Weinberg, which I take to be very much on Jack Stilgoe's view, and internal scientific criteria by Polanyi. To keep a long story short, while Weinberg suggests we should look for the societal benefits of science, Polanyi says, well, only the scientific expert is capable of judging where scientific advances might take place, so we should put the emphasis on them deciding where science should go to. Both perspectives have been criticized. I won't go into the criticism against internal criteria. This was already covered by Stilgoe in my view. But against external criteria, and here I might also criticize Jack Stilgoe's view, it runs the risk of offering a fairly linear, deterministic science-society relationship. Apart from that, we might get a loss of expertise, so who are actually in the position of deciding where science is going, and this introduces many, I would say, principal agent problems. There might be a loss of disinterestedness, autonomy. Science runs the risk of being captured by all kind of military, commercial, and political interests. And of course, the question always remains, okay, which values? And I think Jack is right in that this is central to that debate, but he doesn't solve it, I would say. And who's then to decide, and how to decide on them? In the end, perhaps this distinction between internal and external criteria is merely an analytical division, because, okay, scientists might be opposed a little bit towards introducing external criteria, but when it suits them well, they are also very happy to introduce them, and if it gains them funding. This was already pointed out by Thomas Gehry in 1983. A few words on the Dutch context then, where we have a so-called vernieuwingsimpulse, which is a novelty impulse, where we try to fund autonomous research with a long time span. What does the evidence say on that? Does such a funding scheme work? Well, there's this paper by Pierre Azelai in Rand Journal of Economics, which uses a quasi-experimental research design in which the outcome variable is the number of highly cited publications. And he has two intervention arms, two funding times, let's say. One is high autonomy long-term funding, so which matches a kind of the novelty impulse by the Dutch science policy administration. And the other arm is if it works, low autonomy, short-term funding. And what they find is that this novelty impulse, let's say, funded research produce high-impact publications at a much higher rate than similarly accomplished NIH researchers. I will skip this slide here, follow up to the Dutch National Science Agenda, which is an initiative which tries to align science with society and uses an open call for research questions. So basically asking any citizen to come up with a research question. They rendered 11,000 such questions from society, but I would say a few caveats. What are the grounds to include and exclude questions? Who's to decide on that? Which interests are then served? And what's the additionality of this review process? Do we really get a different outcome than the one we would have had using ordinary peer review? Finally, some remarks about the costs and benefits of research evaluation systems. I think Pierre Azelai is right when he says that we should use the scientific method to evaluate science itself. So are research evaluation systems really effective in what they, let's say, promise? I think it's worthwhile to look at the cost of particular research evaluation systems. Do these costs, or do the benefits outweigh their costs? Of course, and here I would turn to Amartya Sen and also Collini in a book called What Are Universities For? Stress that we should enlarge the set of values that count as cost of benefits. That we should really discuss, okay, what actually counts as effective. We call that Azelai's work before uses highly cited publications. Of course, we could use a different yardstick to assess this effectiveness. But the main point of Azelai, I would say, remains. So we should enlarge the set of values. And finally, I think we should identify tensions among these values and make this debate very much explicit, which remains under the table a little bit so far. I think institutions like the JRC, and especially here the Unit of Econometric and Applied Statistics, is in a nice position to do this kind of work jointly. Because basically ASLA's work, our research evaluation systems effective, calls for impact evaluation studies. Do the benefits outweigh the costs? Basically is about cost-benefit analysis and related fields like multi-criteria decision analysis and composite indicators. And there's a huge role to play, I would say, by science and technology studies to make these values that are entering this debate explicit, which now remain very much internalized with people. That's it.